Alrighty, folks, out of band podcast time in a more improbable comeback than Game 6 of my beloved Rangers versus the Hurricanes. The 48 CFR CMMC rule out of nowhere is back on the menu. So in this episode, we're going to very quickly try to cover what we talked about 3 weeks ago with the anticipated rulemaking calendar for the rest of the year based off new information that came out in the last 24 to 48 hours. Explain what's going on with the 48 CFR rule, explain what's going on in relation to the 32 CFR rule, and some things to know moving forward over the next several months.
What gets your adrenaline pumping more? Is it Game 7s in the NHL Stanley Cup playoffs or last-minute rulemaking that you didn't expect to happen?
That's a tough one. That is definitely a tough one. We'll in a different episode in the future, maybe in an AMA episode on the 2-year anniversary, we'll have to talk about why I live in California, but I am a Rangers fan. Long story, mostly has to do with my my deep frustration with who I chose as a football team. Anyways, different story for a different day. It's Friday, and this is an out-of-cycle podcast, so let's hurry up and move on with it. Okay, so to update everybody on the rulemaking calendar, everything in green is stuff that has already happened. So we have already had a podcast episode about each one of these items. We've had the DIB CS final rule, which expands eligibility into the program for defense contractors and their MSPs. We've talked about the CERC CIA proposed rule, which is going to duplicate incident reporting requirements for the DIB. We've done 2 episodes about that with another one in the works. 800-171 revision 3 is out to much fanfare, except not because the DFAR 7012 class deviation has also been issued, which will delay the amount of time until that is required for contractors. Check out those past episodes. We'll have the links below. Everything else going on in the year in blue are things that we're still waiting on. So we're expecting 800-172 revision 1 to be done by the end of the year. We're expecting the proposed rule for DFAR 7012 3.0, if you will. We're expecting the final rule for 32 CFR CMMC. This is the program rule that was published just after Christmas of 2023, as well as the big one, the FAR CUI rule, which if you're not familiar with, there's an episode that we've done on that topic that you should check out. So the part that's missing on this calendar is the 48 CFR CMMC proposed rule. This is the rule that creates the contract will put the contract clause into defense contracts that specifies a CMMC level requirement, level 1, level 2, level 3, so on and so forth. So this is where the CMMC program will interface with the lives of DIB contractors around the world, theoretically. And it has so far been delayed. We were expecting this to be published originally in Q1 of 2024. Recently, as of a few weeks ago, we had found out that it was delayed inside the Pentagon and that there was some sort of a snag or issue and it got sent back for revisions. Normally, a revision process like that, where it gets sent back, can take weeks, often months of extra time to iron out whatever the issues were. So we were projecting that this wouldn't be published until the end of the year, maybe, depending on how significant the changes were. But breaking news, essentially, it turns out that they figured out whatever that issue was, and they have now submitted that rule up for regulatory review at OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the people who work for the Office of Management and Budget, responsible for doing the regulatory review for all federal executive agency rulemaking. That means that the timeline for when that proposed rule will move to the left dramatically. And instead of being published maybe by the end of this year, it will likely be published this summer based off of now knowable timelines. The longtime listeners will remember through the last, through 2022 and 2023, it was a lot of speculation about when things would start happening. It wasn't until it was actually submitted to OIRA, the 32 CFR CMMC rule, that we could then use actual knowable timelines to project tighter and tighter windows in the cone of uncertainty for when the storm would actually hit everybody. Okay, so just to review what the 48 CFR CMMC rule is. So you can find this on the OIRA website, which we'll link below. So the long and short of it is the 48 CFR CMMC rule implements the 32 CFR CMMC rule. The 32 CFR CMMC rule outlines the nature of the program. It outlines what the levels are. It outlines what the requirements are. It outlines what the roles and responsibilities are. The 48 CFR rule is the DFARS 7021 clause, 2522004 7021 clause that will actually show up in solicitations and contracts that will say, go get a CMMC level 2 cert, go get a CMMC level 3 cert, so on and so forth. Now, something to know about the 48 CFR rule is it isn't creating this clause from scratch. It is revising the 7021 clause because the 7021 clause was originally created in 2020 under the interim final rule, now referred to as CMMC 1.0. So they are not carving from marble from scratch here as much as they are updating and revising the language in the clause to point to the CMMC program resulting from the 32 CFR rule. So they are two sides of the same coin. For the purposes of defense contractors, this is the part that you will actually be interacting with. This is the part that will show up across your desk in your customers' requirements.
So we've talked a lot about different types of rollouts that are going to be impacting the industry with regards to CMMC requirements, right? We've talked about a market rollout, and we've talked about more of a contractual rollout, or would you say industry and market, right? Is what you term them as?
Yeah. So they've got what they call, and we've got a chart on this here in a moment. There's basically, because there's two rules, the original idea was that they'd be published at the same time and that the whole thing would start to roll out together. As it turns out, to the left hand and the right hand inside the Pentagon are two different teams in charge of the two different rules, and they're on two different schedules, which means these rules have now spread apart in terms of when they'll be published as final rules, which means the time when the market goes live and you can pay to get your certification assessment, and the time that the clause is live and starts getting inserted into contracts has now diverged. That has some interesting takeaways that we can talk about in a moment. But we've basically, since Christmas of 2023, been talking about one half of the CMMC rollout overall. Now that this has officially moved over to OIRA, we can now estimate with a much more confidence what things will actually look like.
So my question is now that leads off of kind of like the stem from that is once this rule becomes final, then instead of it being ambitious prime contractors saying, hey, we need our supply chain to get this, these same ambitious prime contractors can start into their supply chain contracts inserting 7021 as a much needed, and now it's a live enforceable clause. Am I?
Yeah, the prime contractors can essentially do whatever they want to, right? Because in a contract between the primes and their subs, that's a contract between two private companies. Once the clause is live, though, it just gives them another thing to use in the forcing function of turning the screws on their suppliers. What the 48 CFR clause really does is it is the thing that gives DoD the ability to put the requirement into contracts. That's always everybody's question, is when will it be in contracts? It's not real until it's in contracts, even though it's going to be pretty real at the market rollout level, which is why we've been emphasizing it. If this is the one that everybody is really focused on, then this is the news that everybody was waiting for. So let's just go into some more detail of the 48 CFR very quickly. You can find references to the 48 CFR rule in the 32 CFR rule that was published at Christmas time of 2023. And there's a couple of ones that jump out here that people should be aware of. First of all, the 32 CFR rule describes the 48 CFR rule as the one that implements the tenets of the CMMC program. They also say once CMMC is implemented in 48 CFR as a contract clause, that's where DoD will specify the required level in your solicitation. So that's when you find out what your fate has in store for you. And probably most interestingly, they say that CMMC assessment and affirmation cost burdens will be addressed in that rule, not in the 32 CFR rule. So the big elephant in the room being, how much is this all going to cost? What's the DoD's estimate for cost? We're supposed to get more information in this upcoming rule about the specific costs on contractors. So I'm sure that's something that everybody's going to want to tune in for when that rule comes out. This isn't like just random clause language, there is extra amplifying information in here that people will want to pay attention to, especially because there's going to be a public comment period, which we'll explain here in a moment.
Again, that points to assessment and affirmation cost. That means cost to get assessed and affirm your compliance, not implement, right? I don't see
Correct.
anything that says implement in there. So
Yep.
if
And
we're
you
waiting
never
on
will,
compliance,
because the CMMC program, as we've talked about probably more than anything else, is the cost of verifying that you have implemented your requirements in accordance with DFAR 7012. CMMC costs are not the costs of implementing the requirements pursuant to DFAR 7012. For comments on the cost of implementation, that's what you should have for the DFAR 7012 rulemaking that's supposed to happen towards the end of this year. But
so
CMMC, different costs.
from my perspective, what this does, this entire change to, I guess, the timeline, right? What this does is, in my mind, I envisioned a situation where there was more pressure coming from prime contractors on their supply chain to get CMMC compliant so they could have their ducks in a row before the DoD actually inserted 7021 into clauses between that prime and the DoD that they were going to accept, right? And that would lead to our market push, that the prime contractors don't want to lose their capability to deliver contracts, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw that happen. But then what I think that what this does is it's going to expedite that process. It's going to turn up the heat on the pan, so to say, and the water's going to boil a lot quicker, because now it's, instead of by the end of the year, we might see this contract clause coming from the DoD to us as the prime. We're going to see it maybe much sooner than that, which means we need to make sure that you're square so we can get ourselves square.
Yeah. This, that phenomenon of the primes accelerating the rollout is something that the DoD can't really do anything about. It's definitely something that we'll see happen as a result of both rules, rather than just one or the other. But okay, so that's what's going on with the 48 CFR rule. Let's just cover the bases very quickly on the status of the 32 CFR rule. And we should be able to fully flesh out what the timelines look like now. So just to remind everybody, DoD originally planned to publish both CMMC final rules, 32 CFR, the program, 48 CFR, the contract clause, at roughly the same time in the first half of 2025. But that is not how things are playing out. So as we know, back in the summer of 2023, that's when the first set of alarm bells went off. The 32 CFR CMMC rule at long last was officially out of the Pentagon and in the hands of OIRA for regulatory review. Regulatory review on paper is supposed to take 90 days. This rule is real big, and there's no real penalty for going beyond 90 days. So they took slightly longer. And sure enough, Merry Christmas, right after Christmas, they published the rule, and there was a standard 60-day public comment period that ended in February. Now, we went back and looked at all of the rules that have been published by DoD since 2009. And as of this episode, as of this evening, updated for all rules in 2023 now. So every rule that was a proposed rule that then became a final rule, all 96 of them that DoD has published since 2009 up through 2023, if you average them all together, it takes 283 business days. That's the 5% trimmed mean of the amount of time from publication to final rule for DoD proposed rules. So if you extrapolate forward from the time that it was published in December of 2023, 283 business days, you end up with April of 2025. Because it is what is known as a major rule, there's an additional piece of red tape under the Congressional Review Act, totally standard. And then at that point, the program is live and the market rollout, as we call it, would begin. Pretty standard, not all that complicated. The X factor here is we're in an election year. And so as a result, DoD and OMB, the administration, is extremely motivated, as all administrations are during an election year, to finish their rulemaking. And so the question is with that motivation, will DoD beat the average and get the rule submitted for regulatory review prior to the election so that you can get through that process and not have it delayed because of transitions and Congress taking new seats and blah, 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 blah. We know that DoD and OMB are highly motivated to beat that timeline. And so in order for that rule to be published by, let's say, October 31st, they would need to have finished their comment adjudication, all that stuff, in 152 business days instead of 280 business days. So the question to ask in your mind is, could they go faster than average given everything that we know about how they're treating the rule? Interesting fact in our analysis for this emergency episode, since 2009, 23% of DoD proposed rules have taken 152 business days or less. 1 in 4 have gone at least that fast or faster. And so when you're asking yourself, can they beat the average? There's some data here to indicate that not only is it possible, it's pretty routine for them to do it when they are sufficiently motivated, as they are in this case. We had somebody request when we posted the episode 3 weeks ago more information on why we think they'll be able to beat the election. So here's 3 reasons why I think that's going to be the case, besides the fact that according to the rumor mill, according to the grapevine out there, DoD is well on the way to completing their comment adjudication process for all of the comments that were submitted from December to February. That's 1,800 or so public comments that they have basically finished adjudicating based off of what we know in the course of like 4 or 5 months. So right off the top, that should let you know that there's probably not going to be a lot of changes between the final rule, between the proposed rule and the final rule, because they had way more public comments on this rule than any rule they've had in the past, more than double the public comments that they had on the 2020 rule. Yeah. And they basically were like, and now they're getting it back into the system. So they're probably not going to be changing a whole lot. But besides that, one of the things that they did, and as it turns out, exactly 1 year ago from this conversation, they sent the rule to the Small Business Administration for review prior to sending it to OIRA for regulatory review. Not something that's mandatory in the normal rulemaking process. Pretty clearly a preemptive step to get the Small Business Administration omni-domni on a rule that's going to have a big impact on small businesses prior to public comments being received, prior to regulatory review taking a look at it. Very smart and wily on the DoD's part. In addition to that, the DoD's 32 CFR rule published at Christmas time of 2023 preemptively responds to public comments that were submitted on the 2020 rule. Typically, you don't see public comment responses in proposed rules. You see public comment responses in final rules. So they front-loaded their public comment responses on this proposed rule, even though they didn't have to, seemingly, in my view, to mitigate the comment reaction, right? Which is probably what enabled them to, as we've heard, go so quickly in their comment adjudication process so far. And then finally, there's a very interesting GAO report from January of 2023 that documents this phenomenon known as midnight rulemaking, in which administrations pump out way more rules in a transition year before an election than any of their other years that are not election years. And this has gone back for many, many administrations so far. And so it just fits right in trend with the idea that they're going to try to hit the boost pad on this rule, along with all the other rules that OMB is overseeing at the time, not just specific to DoD. So those are 3 reasons, 3.5 reasons, if you will, why we think that timeline is going to shift to the left, why they could go from 280 business days to a shorter 150-ish business days to beat that timeline and have that rule published by the end of this year. Okay, so that's the 32 CFR rule. Now we're going to jump down to the other side of the coin, the 48 CFR rule. Now that it has actually been submitted, right, we can see that the 48 CFR rule was submitted to OIRA in May of 2024. Regulatory review is supposed to take 90 days. That would put the publication of the 48 CFR rule in August of 2024. And then assuming there's going to be a standard 60-day public comment period, things would be kicking off in late summer, early fall of 2024. Now, this is a proposed rule. It's not a final rule. This is not an interim final rule, right? So this is the first wave. So we still need to add that 280 business day window for when the final rule would come out for the clause. If you add 280 business days to an August publication, that puts us at the very tail end of 2025 for the rule to be published. Some call it Q4 of 2025 for the rule to be published for the congressional review red tape to go through, and then for DoD's phased rollout of putting clauses into contracts to begin. Now, this is what the data says. This is what the averages say. We could speculate and say, do we think that the 48 CFR rule publication will move to the left earlier in 2025? I think there are some reasons to believe that that will happen. First of all, this is a revision to an existing clause that was already justified via an interim final rule that points to an overarching program that has already gone through full rulemaking. It's not as complicated. It's not as long. It already exists. There's a lot of reasons why it's not as big of a lift for this rule to make it through the process. There's less to read. There's less to review. There's less to check. There's just less stuff going on, even though it's still very impactful. On top of that, DoD is still going to be very motivated to get the rollout going as soon as possible, because even though CMMC will be live in the market rollout, that isn't really DoD's rollout, right? That isn't DoD making contractors do it. That's just sort of the inertia of the market taking over. So, like I said, the 283 business days is the average, and apparently 1 in 4 rules goes 150 business days or faster. So I don't want to make a chart that says this will be shorter, because we don't have any information that says, that indicates it absolutely will be, but it could move to the left. I don't see any reason to believe that it would move to the right, which is what we originally thought. Based off that delay that was supposed to be happening to the 48 CFR rule, we thought that this chart for the 48 CFR rule line was going to move way to the right here, and it wouldn't happen until 2026 sometime, essentially making the gap between when CMMC goes live potentially at the end of 2024 and the rollout in contracts like a year or a year and a half long, which is pretty crazy. Here we're starting to see the two rollout points converge back together. DoD's original idea was they were both going to happen in Q1 of 2025, but at this point, they're definitely coming closer together.
Do you think that there is a case where possibly they may try to expedite the process for 32 CFR and then just let 48 CFR go through the process naturally, not try to expedite it into that before the change of administration type situation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're necessary. I don't think there's a way for the 48 CFR rule to be published as a final rule by the end of 2024. There's something miraculous would have to happen, right? Because we're essentially going to have the rule submitted for regulatory review in May, assuming OIRA takes 90 days plus 60 days of public comment. We're already into the beginning of fall. You got to get those public comments. You got to adjudicate them. Even if it's very formulaic and boilerplate responses, it's still burdensome to have to do the responses. It's got to get reviewed again. Right. There's just stuff that has to happen in that yellow adjudication block, which is why the average is, so long. I don't think that there's a way
because there's so many elements of 32 CFR that, have to play well together. So many cogs that have to move well together that the reason why this is being expedited through the process is because if one change can cascade and can delay it much further. Right. So we just want to get it done and get it out of the way. Wherein the 48 CFR, there's not so many nuances that can change that could, ripple down and make, now we got to fix that. You know what I mean?
We'll have to look, we have to look and see what's in the rule, but really what the rule is doing. And you can see this in the 2020 rule, which we'll link to if people don't have anything to read over the weekend. You can sort of see that the text of the rule is very straightforward. This is just the wording of the clause that goes into the contract. So the only thing that would really shake up the contents of the rule are if DoD expects that the number of affected entities would change, thus changing the cost and burden and impact and small business impact analyses that have to happen in both sets of rulemaking. That's probably not going to happen. Or if the number of CMMC levels were to change, which it definitely won't happen because you're not going to go from 3 to 4 or 3 to 2 or 3 to 64 or whatever. We're going to stick with 3 CMMC levels. This 48 CFR clause rule is saying go get level 1, go get level 2, go get level 3 based off whatever the language of the rule happens to be. So I don't think that the rule is going to take 283 business days, but I don't want to make a chart yet that would say it's going to take less time because we just don't have any indication that there's reason. We don't have any firm reason to say that they will 100% beat the average, like we do with the 32 CFR rule. There's a lot of reasons to believe that they will beat that average. Of course, this is changing rapidly, right? This is something that we talked about heading into this year, that 2024 was going to be very different from 2022 and 2023. There's a lot of rules going on. There's a lot of revisions going on. There's a lot of other agencies doing rulemaking around cybersecurity that's affecting the DIB as well. So there's just more things happening on a faster basis now. We just recorded this episode 3 weeks ago, just gave a presentation at a conference on these charts that are now outdated 2 weeks ago. So if you're not subscribed to the podcast just yet, we don't ask you to do this very often, but if you're not subscribed to the podcast, you should definitely subscribe now, because this is now changing on a near monthly basis, if not faster, based off what's going on. There's multiple rules, there's multiple variables, there's multiple timelines, there's multiple things happening. But as of right now, plan for that market rollout to begin by the end of this year, unless something changes, and plan to see the 48 CFR proposed rule text published and available for comment probably by late summer. And then from there, we'll have to wait and see how quickly the Pentagon is able to adjudicate those comments and if they can beat that average again and then bring those two timelines together.
So have you ever seen that video where he's got his friend putting golf balls on the tee and he is just steadily hitting them in like a steady rhythm and he's just launching them off? Now just take that and substitute like different pieces of rulemaking and guidance documents. And that's basically what the government's doing right now to the DIB is, here's a guidance document, here's a rule, here's a clause. Here, it just keeps going and going and going. And it's so crazy because for the longest time, we sat and we're like, when is it going to rain? When is it going to rain? When is it going to rain? And now all the flowers are nowhere near thirsty.
Yeah, there's a lot of metaphors going on in that
Dude,
that you just made. We definitely need to ask producer Dustin. We definitely need to ask Dustin to make that GIF of that guy hitting golf balls with all the rules and regulations. We'll get that on the queue. He doesn't have anything going on this weekend, but yes, we have been predicting rain for a very long time. I hope everybody's got their umbrella, because the timeline has always been very real. Half of the timeline was very detailed and knowable once the 32 CFR rule went to OIRA in summer of last year. Now the 48 CFR rule has gone to OIRA right before summer of 2024. Those are the two pieces of CMMC. Those are the two rules that establish the program. Once they're both final, that's it. See, we have now gone into a post CMMC rulemaking world where the only real rulemaking that will happen related to CMMC at that point, thank God, is just updating the program to point to new NIST revisions. And I can finally be free of this terrible search and we can talk about actual detailed security requirement guidance with what we were supposed to 3 years ago. But this is what's going on at the rulemaking. This is what the timeline currently looks like. Expect that you will need to read a second CMMC rule here right at the end of summer and prepare accordingly.
Do you remember how we were always told that we kept talking, and we even had an episode about this where people were saying CMMC's delayed, et cetera, and then you came out and you were like, actually, they've been saying since XYZ that it's going to happen on this date, and now we're actually, I just looked at it, we're ahead of that date.
Well, as we talked about before, back in the time of black and white television under CMMC 1.0, the rollout of the contract clause 7021 was supposed to be done by October of 2025. That was the original plan. So depending on who you ask, depending on which part of the timeline you look at, depending on your view of the world, it's delayed, it's not delayed, whatever. At the end of the day,
it's here.
At the end of the day, moving into 2025, it won't matter. It won't matter. It'll be an interesting video that we make, wrapping up the story of CMMC's development process. And it really won't matter if it was delayed a year or 2 years or 6 months or however long, because if you're not ready to go when the market and phased rollouts begin, you're going to be super duper far behind. So
can you imagine looking at all this now and being like, yeah, it's not going to happen.
I hope I really hope. And so, if anybody who's watching this, I know we have a lot of people watching who take this information and then they go to their company leadership to tell them, hey, this is a real thing, in order to try to help get those projects started for their implementations. If that's true, then, you definitely want to nudge them on this one. This is, it's getting very, very real at this point. This is now both timelines for both CMMC rules have knowable dates, which is something we have not had before.
Yep.
Alrighty. That's it. That's the update for everybody on the 48 CFR rule. That's what's going on, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.